My Lords, it's a huge privilege to follow Lord Bruce of Benachie. I first heard him speak more than 30 years ago when he was president of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. I was an undergraduate, and he was then as now detailed, good-humoured, generous to opponents, as he is in all his interventions. I feel, looking at who else is speaking after me, that it's probably going to fall to me to point out that there is an alternate case. There is a counter-argument, and it was best expressed by the great American economist Thomas Sowell, that foreign aid, if badly done, can provide perverse incentives. You end up rewarding countries that are doing the wrong thing and ceasing to reward countries that are doing the right thing. That foreign aid, if badly done, becomes an alternative revenue stream so that a government doesn't need to raise money through taxation, and that this can lead to bad democratic as well as bad economic outcomes. And there are numerous surveys, both comparing countries in receipt of aid and not, and the same country in times when it was and when it wasn't, that show that there can be these negative correlations. None of this, however, is an argument against foreign aid. It's an argument against doing it wrongly or doing it without proper concentration on the outcomes. There's a general argument, I think, against feeling that you're doing the right thing if you put a fiver into every outstretched hat without thinking through exactly where it's going. So, to take the most uncontroversial aspects of it, I think we can all agree that governments have an important role to play with disaster relief. The capacity of many countries is simply not up to dealing with extraordinary catastrophes that are not budgeted for normally. Governments also have an important role to play in doing the things that, if you like, the unsexy things that charities will struggle to raise the money for. There's a lot to be said, for example, for improving infrastructure, but that's a much harder thing to raise money for from the general population than clinics or schools or whatever. We're doing quite a lot of good work in Africa. We, the UK, DFID, are funding a lot of schemes on practically removing trade barriers at borders. So not dealing with the treaties, but dealing with the actual implementation so that you increase the flow of goods across borders, which is, of course, an incredibly important poverty alleviation mechanism, but it's going to be one that no charity is going to be able to make a big appeal out of. So let's all agree, and actually I think Lord Bruce put it very well, we've refocused on areas that are more important and where we, if you like, we get more bang for our buck. There was a particular move during the coalition years that he referred to, away from funding organisations that spent a lot of money on advocacy and trying to refocus them onto spending money on getting actual product on the ground in the places where they were delivering. And I think that was the right thing to do. I think there was a certain dishonesty involved with some organisations who would raise money saying, you know, we're going to provide farm tools for a family in Zimbabwe or whatever, and then the bulk of their budgets would go on lobbying operations in London. So we have, if you like, already done a number of good things. We are becoming more focused, and it is possible to get a great deal out of limited budgets. But where, and I'm afraid I'm going to make myself incredibly unpopular, not for the first time as I say this, but where I really do have a problem is with the idea of setting arbitrary budgetary targets, whether for overseas aid or for any other aspect of government spending. First of all, I think it's always a bad idea to judge your policy in terms of the cost rather than the outcome. I think this is true whether it's a local council budget or whether it's a Whitehall department. I think there is a lamentable tendency that carries on under this Conservative government to boast about the fact that you're spending 200 million on X or Y, rather than at looking at what you're doing with it. And that also creates perverse incentives. But I think there's a deeper problem, and it's the democratic one. I mean, it may very well be desirable to spend 0.7% of GDP on international assistance. It may very well be desirable to spend 2% of GDP on defence, as the NATO alliance demands. But then if those things are true, why isn't it equally desirable to spend whatever arbitrary figure we come up with on education, or on healthcare, or on policing? At which point, what's the point of having general elections? Democracy is about the arbitration of competing goals. It's not our job in this chamber, but it is, I would argue, the primary job of the other place. There are clashing interests, people who have perfectly good arguments for why they need more money. There isn't a magic wand, there isn't a magic money tree, and it is the role of elected representatives to decide on the most equitable outcome. And if all of that is lifted out of the democratic process and set in stone in statute, or even, as Gordon Brown now suggests, in a constitutional settlement that would guarantee a certain amount of health spending or whatever, then there is precious little point in people voting at all. We did indeed show leadership, whether or not we use the phrase superpower in foreign aid, but I think we also have historically shown leadership as a democracy. We've held up an example of a free, open society in which the leaders are answerable to the wider population, and we've shown that that model works, and people around the world have chosen to mimic it. For that reason, if no other, we should be very careful about abandoning the principle that taxes should not be raised except by elected representatives.